So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give a few more minutes just to allow everyone to log in, and then we'll kick off this final panel discussion for today. It's great that you've come back and joined us at the end of the day. So thank you all for that. So let's just, as we're just getting everyone to join, maybe I'll just do a quick introduction to the session itself. What we're going to be focusing on here is focusing on combating modern slavery, looking at the challenges associated with that, but also the focus on good working conditions and the things that we need to do differently as we take it down. So what I'm really keen to do here is to open this up and maybe have quite a broad discussion, if you like, around exactly what we should do and how we should go about doing it. I'm delighted to be joined today by three excellent panelists, and I'm sure we'll bring the whole topic to life as we go forward. We've got Malcolm Harrison, our Group CEO. Any of you who are around at the beginning of the session today would have seen him doing a quick introduction and a focus on the importance that procurement is playing at the moment. So welcome to you, Malcolm. We're also joined by Dame Sarah Thornton. So Dame Sarah is the UK's Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, with real responsibility for encouraging good practice in the prevention and detection of modern slavery and the identification of victims within that space. So we're delighted that Dame Sarah has managed to join us today and to share some of her insights and thoughts on that. And then we're also joined by Simon Lee, who I think he told us is joining us from Turkey. But it's great that he's sort of, which is why it's dark outside, I think, Simon. But great that you managed to join us. Simon is the Group Procurement and Supply Chain Director at Whitbread, probably best known for the Premier Inn hotel brand. And I know it's been a real focus within Whitbread for focusing on the issues of modern slavery and working conditions for people as they go through. So welcome to you as well, Simon. Thanks. So what we'd like to do is open this up. We are going to have some polls as well. So we're going to hopefully get some interaction going at the end of the first day of the conference with you all. So be ready for that as they come through. But Malcolm, maybe can I just come to you initially for just a quick introduction?
Yeah, thanks very much, Duncan. I think, look, I mean, this is an incredibly important topic, and nobody can claim any longer to be unaware of the issue of modern day slavery. I mean, look at events this year in the apparel industry, more specifically in the UK, in Leicester, when it's made headline news. I mean, it is a heinous crime. It's absolutely abhorrent to society. And in my view, it's supply chain managers and procurement professionals that have a fundamental responsibility to lead the eradication of it. And I guess my perspective is I'm not sure people have really been looking hard enough or deep enough for some of these issues. They're being exposed by NGOs, they're being exposed by journalists. And my sense is that maybe businesses just need to be a bit more honest about the fact that some of their supply chains might not be perfect. I think this is also a real area for collaboration. It's not about competitive advantage. It's about how does industry find ways of creating networks to support vulnerable workers. So this is an incredibly important topic. I'm really looking forward to participating in this panel.
Thank you, Malcolm. And maybe just building on that, I think it's probably worth us going to the first poll, because Malcolm, you just talking there about whether or not companies are really taking the threat of labour exploitation and modern slavery seriously. So I don't know if we can maybe share the first poll and get you all to sort of contribute to that. So, the question here is, how much is your company doing to really tackle the threat of labour exploitation and modern slavery in its supply chains? Just give you a couple of seconds maybe to just quickly cast your vote on that, and we can have a quick look at what the results are that's coming through. So if you could just click on one of the buttons, and then we'll have a quick look then at the results from that. Just while you're doing that as well, I just remind you all that when you get an opportunity, if you want to ask any questions, we'll hopefully give some time at the end for that, and put your questions in the Q&A within the bar at the bottom of the Zoom thing. So maybe, Sean, can we sort of have a look and see what the answers are of the poll? So that's encouraging. There's sort of 38% we're doing some good work. There's others are very active, so that's 18%. So we're probably looking half of the companies doing some good work, but others, just aiming for compliance and not doing much at all as we go forward. So sort of interesting dynamic there. So thank you for that. Thank you for your insights. And maybe that's a good lead in, sort of, Dame Sarah. I mean, the current pandemic, the recession that's associated with it is clearly an opportunity for people to maybe exploit their workforce more than they have in the past, and the financial pressures that are associated with that. So from your role and looking at it very much as a independent focus on this area, what are you seeing during this time, and what do you think is happening at the moment? And do we need to be even more vigilant when we're in a time of a pandemic and a recession?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I think the pandemic has highlighted weaknesses in our systems of procurement in the same way that it's highlighted issues around social care, child poverty in the UK, and other issues elsewhere. I mean, you all know that global supply chains present real risks in terms of forced and unfree labour. They're an ever-present risk. And of course, the most recent circumstances, coupled with demand, sudden demand, high demand for new items such as PPE, sanitizer, perspex, they create the perfect environment in which exploitation can flourish. And if you wanted a great example of that, the impounding of all those rubber gloves in the US because they were based on forced labour is just a kind of a graphic example, I think, of the risks that are in global supply chains. In terms of what we've been seeing, I speak to NGOs from across the world and listen to their accounts, which have been pretty harrowing, whether it's the impact of cancelled orders in places like Bangladesh, unpaid wages in many parts of the world, and the way in which borders have closed, which of course has led to huge impact and hardship amongst migrant groups, but has also created shortages of workers and therefore forced labour for those who remain. So a significant issue right across the globe. Just talking about the UK for a minute or two, during the last 6 months, we've actually identified fewer victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. And I think that's probably because a lot of the harms have become hidden. And there's a real concern that there's less visibility. And not only are issues more hidden, but regulators certainly have been less able to do their work. And in some cases, that might also apply to law enforcement. Malcolm mentioned at the beginning the spotlight that's been on the textile industry, particularly Leicester. And it's important to remember where that came from. It was that overlap between health and safety concerns and then labour abuse concerns that led it, as you say, to be kind of a key part of discussions in the media for quite a while. And I was really interested to see the report that one of the main companies involved, Boohoo, put out, written by an independent lawyer, Alison Levitt, who looked at the level of non-compliance and law breaking in all the subcontractors, which she quoted lots of reasons to believe it was quite substantial, but then also concluded that she didn't think the brand had broken any law. And I think that's ignited a discussion about whether the current systems, the current law is sufficient, and again, kick-started that discussion about greater liability for brands and retailers, maybe a greater insistence on human rights due diligence, or indeed the licensing of certain employers. So, I mean, I think the pandemic has really highlighted the issue, but it's also, I think, begun to stimulate a debate about what some of the solutions might be.
And I thank you for that. And I think it's very interesting what you're saying there is that, you need to be more vigilant, but maybe there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we're not seeing at the moment. And that's probably quite a challenge for us. And maybe, Simon, if I can come to you on that. I mean, from what you're seeing within Whitbread, from the focus that you've got, I mean, are you seeing more examples of modern slavery? I suppose, and what are you doing in your organisation to try and manage and mitigate those risks?
Yeah, I think, hi Duncan, I think we'll probably cover a bit more detail in the questions as we kind of go through in the specifics around kind of what we put in place in Whitbread, so I won't kind of run the risk of duplication. I think Dame Sarah's point is excellent, and what we're currently facing into is layer upon layer of additional complexity that you wouldn't typically have to be facing into. Now, don't get me wrong, the levels of the supply chain and the need to go through kind of complicated, extended supply chains to understand, map your risks and manage your risks. That's kind of, you would do in a normal environment, which we certainly do at Whitbread as part of the responsible sourcing program. But when you overlay economic disruption, when you overlay pressure on businesses and individuals that are beyond bad choices that they may be trying to make to make additional money during a normal kind of environment through really bad behaviour, you actually get a kind of a situation where there's businesses now quite desperate to survive, and there's individuals desperate to survive, and they then start trading off. It becomes a series of unpalatable choices potentially, and that's where people, can kind of fall into vulnerable groups. And that's where, from my viewpoint, being very, conscious of that, and the program that we have in place that I'll kind of go into a bit more detail on, shortly, that kind of level of diligence and that level of, being really clear around where those high risk areas are and where that potentially, could come to light. That's, where it's really, really important, because, we are kind of dealing in desperate times and uncertain times, and, that just provides a platform, unfortunately, for people to abuse it and abuse, the situation with people's desperation. So, I think we're looking through more lenses than we might have typically been looking through before, beyond, financial pressures and typical kind of risks that we would look to kind of manage.
So maybe just you said you come on to a couple of things that you're doing. So do you want to just maybe bring to light a couple of the focus that you've got within Whitbread and some of the actions that you are putting in place to try and sort of mitigate these risks?
Yes, I mean, if I kind of pick up on some of the steps that we've put in place in the organisation, not just kind of, if you think outside of the COVID piece, so actually kind of what are we doing to look at being, as a a member of the FTSE 100, we've got obligations and commitments to business and shareholders, but we've actually also got a big ethical thread that runs through the business in relation to just doing the right thing. And we have a program called Force for Good, and that program really does focus on everything from human trafficking, kind of modern slavery, working time conditions, ethical sourcing, sustainability, and that's what kind of underpins, or kind of that's effectively what our responsible sourcing program hangs kind of from. And when you look at the complexity of the supply chain within Whitbread, we, it's everything from, if you run across kind of food and beverage, so we have to think about kind of the extended supply chains from farms and growers, and where you typically then see you've got risks around kind of contract labour in that environment, and therefore you need to be quite thoughtful about that. Construction, we build hotels, we build restaurants, we refurbish sites, again, labour within construction, and we've spent quite a bit of time previously working with kind of almost how do we educate industry and influence industry, and we spent time last September working in an event with our strategic partner Stop the Traffic, to actually run a piece on human trafficking and modern slavery specifically, again to encourage and ensure that we're driving the right behaviours within that area. Supply chain and logistics, again for us it's another high risk area, and it's one that we need to make sure we continue to focus on when you start thinking about warehouse operatives and again contract labour that sits there. Services, we run, with huge dependency on laundries, as an example, within our hotels. So again, another environment that is heavily driven by, reliant upon people. And we also internationally source. So we've got a sourcing centre in Shanghai. We do a lot of direct sourcing as well. And that direct sourcing certainly picked up a lot of the PPE requirements as we were kind of going through the pandemic. And when thinking about kind of additional things that we've done to ensure that, that the environment's right, a lot of these suppliers were new suppliers to us as well, because we weren't typically procuring large volumes of face masks, gloves, face shields, and perspex screens. They were suddenly a new category kind of appears, and we have to manage it appropriately. But that meant, we were very much focused on kind of transparency, knowing what we were getting, being really, really clear around kind of what we were getting, where we were getting it from, visibility. So more important about kind of knowing kind of where it comes from. It's actually going and seeing it. So the team in China, went through a series of ethical audits and ensuring that they're going and visiting the physical factories and seeing it. And the last one, I think Malcolm kind of touched on this as well. So communication for us, it's very, very important to build really good relationships with those suppliers, not just the PPE guys that were providing this product to get us through this situation, but ongoing across all of the areas that I mentioned previously, making sure that you build trust. If you can't build trust with your suppliers, you don't get the right dialogue, you don't get the right level of conversation. You end up in a position where you can't help them manage some of the risks, and they end up making bad decisions. So I think the program we've been running, it's been running now for about 6 years, and a big part of that has been incredibly helped by our strategic partnership with Stop the Traffic.
That's really good, Simon. And actually, what you just described there is a very comprehensive program. And maybe coming back to you, Sarah, and I'm going to bring you in, Malcolm. I mean, is that what Whitbread are doing? Is that normal, or are they quite unusual, do you think, in terms of the focus that they've got and I think the extent of the program that they're working on here?
So I always try and avoid bigging up one commercial brand over another. So forgive me for not doing so, Simon. But I would say, in terms of the response from business, it's very mixed. We did a piece of work earlier in the year looking at a substantial labour abuse investigation, which led to convictions, known as Operation Fort. And when we did work in the light of that, with a variety of different, mainly supermarkets, you just realise what a kind of variety of approaches there are. There are some organisations which are really focused on human rights, really focused on really drilling down into the risk, thinking about worker engagement. And as Simon was listing all the things that he does under Force for Good, I could have ticked off my list. They're the sorts of things that we would be wanting the good organisations to be doing. And it's also, as you say, these supply chains are long and complex, particularly if they're global. And it's how you can cascade those ethical standards, those requirements, by working collaboratively with your suppliers and not ditching them at the first sign of trouble. That's the easiest thing to do, isn't it? But actually, how can you work with suppliers to raise standards for workers and to ensure that people are treated properly and aren't exploited in any way?
I suppose, coming to you, Malcolm, I mean, I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, I think you started by saying maybe businesses aren't doing enough. And I suppose, does that reinforce it from what you just heard from Simon there?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think Whitbread are a very good example. Unfortunately, there are some organisations out there that don't put the focus that perhaps a brand owner like Whitbread does put onto this topic. And I do think it's down to businesses to look deep into their supply chains. And sometimes that's not easy, because sometimes you don't know who your suppliers or your suppliers are, and that could well be where the issue is. But I guess, Duncan, what I would always say is the principles of sort of integrity and ethics lie at the heart of the profession. That's right at the heart of procurement and supply. And this is all about integrity and ethics. So for me, there is no real excuse for saying, oh, I didn't look. And yes, supply chains are long and complex, but I can remember some very good brand owners, and I think I will be careful maybe to call names out, but I can remember some very good brand owners years and years ago looking really deep into their supply chains, looking down into China, looking at what was happening in terms of labor practices in China. And I also know that there were other organizations that didn't send people to look at their suppliers. They didn't use local people on the ground to audit or to inspect, because they kind of saw it as a cost that they felt they couldn't afford. Now, my argument would be it's a cost that you can't not afford, because you've got to protect the integrity of your supply chain. So I do think it's a mixed picture. I do think the good people do it really well. And I do think there are a lot of people that are nowhere near as good as they need to be.
Thank you. Yeah, and I suppose the challenge then is where do you take modern slavery into account? How do you do that effectively as you go forward? And I'm going to open this up to a second poll, if I may, because I think we've got a question to the audience. We've got two questions, actually. So one is, really asking you, to what extent do you take anti-slavery measures into account when you're looking at new suppliers and contracts? Because that's obviously a key decision-making time as to whether or not your suppliers and your supply chain is really taking it into account. And there's an interesting one, and maybe this comes back to one of the points that Sarah was making a bit earlier about laws. You know, do you think that there are tougher laws needed to make businesses more accountable for abuses in their supply chain? We know there's a Modern Slavery Act in the UK. We know there's ones in Australia. We know there's ones in other parts of the world. But would you support tougher laws? So it'd be very interesting to get your thoughts on both of those questions. So if you can sort of tick, we're not giving you an extensive list of choices here, so I'm sure it would take you a couple of minutes just to be able to tick on both of those. But I think when you're ready, Sean, if you can maybe just show us the results from those. So there's, in terms of taking into account human rights and anti-slavery measures, again, we've probably got quite a strong percentage of people taking it into account, which is encouraging. I think it's probably more encouraging than I'd expected it to be, which is great. But I think it's really interesting there that there is a very, very strong view that there should be tougher laws in place to make businesses more accountable as we go forward. I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether, you know, with the countries where it isn't in place, but also those countries where we do have it in place, whether that should be done more effectively. So thank you for those inputs. That's great. And Malcolm, maybe sort of coming to you, and building on those thoughts. I mean, looking at the procurement professionals, looking at what people should be doing, what sort of advice and guidance would you give to them?
Look, I think the first thing I would say is, and I agree, law will help, but I don't think you can't just rely upon the law. And I think as a procurement and supply professional, you've got to focus on what's going on in your supply chain. And you've got to focus on what's going on deep in your supply chain. But I think you need to take a risk-based approach. Okay, so don't assume that every single supplier or every single category you're going to put the same amount of focus on. So to look at those categories which you think are most exposed, maybe because of some of the practices that you've heard about, maybe because of some of the countries that you're sourcing from. I do think this is an area for collaboration, and I do think this is where you should think about industry or sector solutions. I can't agree with anybody that ever suggests that this is an area of competitive advantage. It's not. This is about raising the bar. It's about minimum standards. It's about protecting workers, and particularly vulnerable ones. So I do think this is an area where you should collaborate. I also think, and I think somebody else said it earlier on, this is about trying to help your suppliers. It's not about trying to catch them out and throw them under the bus and not use them any longer. And I think there's some good supply chain programs out there now, Duncan. There are some good courses. I mean, I think CIPS has got one, and there are other ones as well, which are looking at how do you really improve supply chains? How do you address modern slavery? And there's a huge focus on gap analysis, on risk assessment, what your due diligence plans are, but then what are your corrective action plans? How are you going to eliminate and improve rather than catch out? And how do you support your suppliers through that? I do think that is incredibly important. And what I'd like to think is we'll get to a place, and perhaps this will come as we talk about how do we build back better post the COVID pandemic. I'd like to think that people will think more about how do you champion good working conditions? How do you look at the positive? How do you accentuate the positives rather than always be trying to only eliminate the negatives? So I think there's a lot that the profession can do, but I would start by saying, take a risk-based approach, collaborate, benchmark, pick up ideas from others, and then really, really do focus on improving, not just on trying to catch people out.
I think that improvement piece there is probably a key one there. And I mean, Simon, maybe come back to you on that. From you talked about a 6-year program you've been working on within Whitbread, and obviously gradually layering in more elements of that. I mean, from your perspective, what advice and guidance would you give to others where they're either starting on this journey or they're looking to really focus more on championing workers' conditions and improving them as they go forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'd come back to kind of one of the points that Malcolm made. I think you need to look across kind of risk management more holistically. of which, you know, there are a number of risks kind of that as a really good procurement function you would be typically looking to manage anyway. You know, surety of supply, etc. We could name them. I think in this kind of situation, when you start getting more into kind of the ethical sourcing and the responsible sourcing, and it ties back into sustainability and the commercial, you know, the decisions that, you know, the standards you want to set, the process that you want to embed, and you know, a little bit about what you want to be kind of remembered by, kind of with your suppliers, is actually you're a good person to do business with, and you're considered in the way that you operate, and you're responsible in the way you operate. So I think building up for me, it's about building up a risk program that goes across, that helps not only us operate and be comfortable that we're doing, you know, we're standing next to those obligations, but ensure we're also having very good regular dialogue with our suppliers around actually improvement programs and how they can continue to kind of get better. It is a journey together, you know, without a shadow of a doubt. And I couldn't support more the message around actually how can we continue to work with suppliers that need to develop, as opposed to kind of just exiting suppliers, because it just churns a problem. It doesn't improve anybody, and you end up actually, everybody ends up wasting their time. I think, you know, for me, it's how can we set a standard that absolutely becomes a given, because then you level the playing field. If everybody turns around and says we're going to hit certain standards in relation to ethical sourcing, specifically human trafficking, modern slavery, and that becomes a consistent standard across our profession, you know, for me, that then levels, you know, that then stops people just discounting doing the work because it's too expensive. You know, that's got to stop. So it comes back to how can you control and ensure and legislate to a degree that these things happen, and motivate people to do it for the right reasons, as opposed to it being punitive. But definitely getting, you know, a really good program in place. I would certainly, you know, be an advocate of saying get a partner on point, get a partner on board. And you know, I reference Stop the Traffic. We've got a brilliant long-term relationship with them, but get someone that challenges you and challenges your business as well, and actually says, you know, kind of asks you, not just gives you helps you set a program up in relation to how you manage the risk, but actually challenge you, you know, to do things differently and think differently, and actually think about, you know, beyond what we might need to do to meet a standard. Is actually what can we do to, you know, improve beyond that, and how can we continue to, you know, land such a program efficiently. And you know, this is part of our sourcing process end to end. So it's kind of the heartbeat that kind of goes through. It's all of the commercial lens, as well as this is also a massive part of any kind of sourcing process and management post contract as well.
I think just linking that into, maybe coming back to you, Sarah, in terms of a question around, I suppose, business leadership, because what you're describing there, Simon, is the fact that there's a lot of sourcing activity needed. And you talked about a level playing field, but you do need, as you know, obviously within Whitbread, you've obviously got, you know, leadership and sponsorship for making those changes across the business. Maybe sort of, Sarah, come to you. I mean, do you see that there's a increased motivation and action from business leaders to get under the skin of their supply chains, to actually almost like encourage the procurement teams to go out and look for what's going on and unearth it? I mean, are you seeing that change?
I think that similar to the answer to the last question, there is a very mixed response across the board, I would say. The very best companies are leading at that board level, that it's not just something that's corporate social responsibility, or not just something for the guys in procurement. Actually, this is for the leadership of the organisation, because we are a business that values people and planet as much as it does profit. And the companies that make those sorts of messages, we all know who they are. I mean, I think that leadership of the very top makes a huge difference. If I may comment on that last poll, that 92% were supportive of tougher laws. Now, actually, that surprised me. It was higher than I thought it would be. But then I suspect that reflects the fact that a lot of the people who are listening really do yearn for that level playing field. And they don't think it's fair that some people can get away with it, seemingly, and they're trying to do the right thing. So I suspect that speaks a lot to the sorts of people, Malcolm, who belong to your organisation. But I do agree with your point, Malcolm, that most of the time what we want to do is encourage improvement and the right sort of behaviour, because actually we want business to be a force for good rather than something which damages either people or the planet. But I do think for those who are persistently reluctant to get on board, then maybe that 92% in favour of a tougher legal approach should be listened to.
Sarah, can I pick that up and add to it? Because I suspect there may, and I've looked at some of the questions coming in, because I suspect there may also be a question here around resources, and around have people got the time to put into managing all of their suppliers and ensuring that all of them are being properly audited and all of them are really improving the way they should do. And unfortunately, many procurement teams are not as resourced as well as they could and maybe should be, and you can't do this with zero resource. So I think this comes back to the point I think I made earlier on around the importance of collaboration. There is nothing wrong with working with your competitors here to be able to raise those standards to the minimum level. And what you don't want is your suppliers to spend all of their time being audited. What you'd rather have is you had minimal audits, but really high quality audits. Everybody who's using the supplier is happy to accept that audit, and maybe it's done by one party on behalf of many, or maybe it's done by an independent party. And then you get the time and the focus into improvement. And you get suppliers putting their effort into how do they improve, not just on spending all of their time on how do they get through one audit, then another audit, then another audit. And I do think there are some real opportunities here for cross-industry collaboration to be able to work together, competitors working together to help suppliers raise those minimum standards exactly the way that Simon was talking about. But if everybody tries and does that on their own, one, you're going to have trouble getting consistency of standards, and two, that there won't be enough resource to go around.
And I think that links, as you say, Malcolm. I was just scrolling through the questions that's coming as you're talking there, and that sort of, there's a number of questions there about different schemes, different areas where you can look for information. The collaboration, the sharing of information is key. But there was also a question coming through, two questions really. One is around supply chain, and maybe sort of Simon, you've got your main suppliers, and then they've got their supply chains. How do you get them to really take responsibility for looking at the issues all the way down through the supply chain? And then the second question, which maybe we should wrap up on, is probably around skills. So I think there's a question coming through here about the skill set that you need to do this, as well as sustainability, as well as looking at other challenges that procurement's got, planning for Brexit if you're in the UK, coping with COVID crises. The skill sets required to focus on this. But maybe, Simon, if we can come to the first one to you, which is about contractors. What's your view on that sort of tier level? And you talked about construction, I suppose, is a good example. How do you make sure that they do take that full responsibility?
The piece of work that I did kind of touched on earlier was specifically, we built it in conjunction with our partner, and we ran a session with some of our main contractors and some of their key subcontractors as well. So the people that we would typically use across kind of refurb and construction, and it's not just kind of a one-off event. These things need to continue, but it was really how it comes back to my point about how can we influence our suppliers about the standards that we expect, and actually beyond to Malcolm's point, beyond just the audits that get completed, but actually how can we bring, put a bit of colour around it, bring it to life, and emphasise the importance of, what we're doing and why we're doing it, beyond it's just we're policing a situation. No, we're absolutely not. We need to work kind of really good, thoughtful plans together on how we can actually tackle this problem, and recognise, I think, as well, that it is a real problem. It's not something that's, we might be slightly blind to it at times, but it happens and it affects people. So we have a shared obligation to ensure that, to Sarah's point, that we do the right thing by people as opposed to just doing the right thing as an organisation. So I think there's an opportunity there to run, certainly with your tier one really key suppliers, looking, working with them to make sure where there's extended risks, understanding their responsibility to help you manage those extended risks as well, and ensure that they're following a similar kind of program within their organisations as well, and encouraging them at the benefit of doing it. So I'd say there's always ongoing education, and there's always an ongoing opportunity to, you know, try to influence. And, you know, Malcolm touched on it, is how can you influence groups of people and sectors, you know, kind of industries to think differently. And that's kind of an opportunity, but on a smaller scale, you know, an example on a smaller scale of where we've certainly been doing it in construction. But it gets very complicated. So don't think for 1 minute that we've gone down to tiered, you know, we've got everything mastered. We haven't. And that, I guess my point I'd like to make is it's a continuous program, and it evolves, and you have to kind of it is a bit of a journey. So it's not that you're going to just get it all done overnight, set a program and you're there. You've got to be prepared that this does take time, and it comes into some of the questions. You know, how can you build that time in? And I think as part of your category planning, as part of your good ways of working, as part of your good tendering and sourcing and contracting and post-contract management, that's where you've got to try to say, actually, we underpin, you know, as part of those processes, these really good disciplines. We make sure that we do it kind of once we're in kind of that really, you know, post-contract, and we're working with suppliers within, you know, within the everyday working environment. So it's a bit of a journey. It doesn't just happen overnight. I think finding someone that can help you kind of build up what that looks like is very important.
Okay, thank you. Conscious of time here, maybe some closing comments from yourself, Sarah, and from Malcolm on this in terms of your sort of advice or guidance for people when they're looking to try and do more in this area. Maybe Sarah, come to you first, and then Malcolm, I'll leave you to do a wrap up.
I was going to say, I'm no expert on the skills required of procurement professionals, and I'm sitting amongst experts, so I won't dare go there. But I think I'd just like to make one kind of key comment and then back it up with why I think it's important. It seems to me that despite everything we say about the leadership of organisations, those of you who work in procurement are in a particularly powerful position to get this right. You are particularly influential, and I would hope that you would use that, the power and influence you have for good. And one of the reasons that I think this is, you know, blatantly the case, partly because of the role you have, but I was talking to the professor who did the work on the Leicester textile industry 5 years ago, and he talked then about the importance of the buyers understanding the cost of making a product in the textile industry, a dress or a jacket, whatever it was. And fast forward to today, where the debate still is that the people who are going out, the buyers, have no idea about factoring that cost of labour. And it seems to me, from my position of not knowing very much about what you should do if you're a professional procurement person, but to understand better the cost of labour in what you're procuring, and that to be a key factor seems to me to be a pretty basic building block. Thanks.
That's a really good insight, Sarah. Thank you for that. I suppose I thank both you and Simon for insights and perspectives you've given there. Consciously, we're running out of time here, so maybe I think what we'll do is we'll wrap this panel up, and then Malcolm, I'll give you a chance to maybe sort of close some views on that, and maybe move on to sort of closing the views and comments on the day. But I think, you know, Sarah, Simon, really appreciate your time today and the insights that you've given us on this topic. And you're absolutely right, it's a long-term program that we need to work on. So thank you both, and thank you for joining us at this session this afternoon. So really appreciate that. So Malcolm, maybe we'll just we'll turn our videos off, and we'll leave you to do a wrap up. I think close, Malcolm.
Great, thanks very much, Duncan. Again, and my thanks also to Simon and Dame Sarah Thornton for joining us. And sorry, your last point there about cost. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Good sourcing professionals, good procurement professionals always understand both cost and price. Yeah, it's not just about price. You have to understand cost as well. So yeah, we should be absolutely in the right place to understand that one. But thank you very much, and thank you for that final panel, and that really important topic sort of brings to a close the first day of the CIPS 2020 conference. And it just leaves me, I guess, to make a few concluding remarks on what's been a very full day. We started with John, it seems a long time ago now, John Glenn and Peter Monkton from Queensland, setting the tone with a sense of the economic challenges that we're all going to face wherever we are in the world due to the impact of the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic. But long term, I got the sense that we were saying, the economists are saying things look positive, but be ready for more shocks in the short term. So be prepared. Make sure your supply chains are resilient. And that kind of led us on to a very good discussion with participants from Lufthansa, from the Intercontinental Hotels Group and the UK Ministry of Defence, where we talked about what they're doing to make their supply chains more resilient, how they're looking at sourcing differently, how they're still all very focused on ensuring that value is delivered, because that is always going to be important, particularly at a time when we know economies are likely to be weaker. But it was all about some of the things they were doing to cope with those significant changes in demand and how they're reshaping their supply chains due to the impact of COVID-19. We then had some great discussions around sustainability, and that was a particularly good panel, I felt. Tackling climate change, how do we make responsible decisions around using scarce resources, all of these issues which are fundamental to the future of our planet. We heard from Mars, from Bayer, from Amazon, from British Telecom, about how their organizations are really addressing this head on. They all talked about the high level commitment from their organizations. I think that's a really important insight from today. And then they talked about the role that they see procurement taking in leading that within their supply chains. And they all talked about the importance of partnering, about not trying to do all of this on your own. None of us, I think, got the chance to get to all of attend every breakout stream, but there was some fantastic content there, absolutely fantastic, and some great debates. And if you missed something or you want to see it again, then everything has been recorded and it can be watched back on demand for the next 30 days from this Friday. Not until Friday. We need a little bit of time to get all those recordings uploaded, but once we've done that, everything will be available, particularly those breakout streams, as well as these plenary sessions, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at them. But I can't cover all of the topics, but I thought the one on creating social value was great. There was a super one on how do you manage greenhouse gas emissions. There was stuff around improving supplier diversity, driving supplier innovation, adopting digitalization. Those were just some of the topics that were covered. If you haven't had the time yet to watch the ITN Productions program, Supply, Support, Sustain, then please do. Now that is accessible, and it's accessible from the list of videos in the CIPS booth and the exhibition lobby. Then please do and learn some of the great practices that are taking place, and particularly some of the new tools that are available to support us as professionals. And that is available now, so do go and have a look at that. Many of today's presenters, though, have talked about issues which are really important to citizens, to our consumers, to societies today across the world. They've talked about the way that the leading role of procurement and supply professionals can really help address those issues. It's certainly a really exciting time to be in this profession, and it is a really exciting profession. You've asked lots of questions. Thank you very much. That's what I asked you to do at the start of the day. We've had really too many questions to be able to answer. We're going to try and answer those through the chat rooms, and we're going to make those responses available online. And then we're going to do some of that through social media. And I've already seen some discussions starting on social media, like there's a CIPS Connect and Exchange platform on LinkedIn. There are other social media platforms out there, but use those, please. Join, network. We always said that what we wanted to achieve through these 2 days was to bring the profession together, to share experiences, to encourage networking. And we're going to try and get as many of the answers to some of those unanswered questions out there as we can, but we'll do it through the chat rooms. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. Been some fantastic speakers, and especially to our chairs, John, Duncan, Oliver, Kerry, Emma. Thank you all very much for the time you've put into so expertly chairing these panels. But most of all, a huge thanks to all of you for joining. We've had nearly 2,000 delegates from over 100 countries. The UK, Nigeria, Ghana, Australia, before they went to sleep, USA, even before they woke up, the United Arab Emirates, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, I think were the top 10. But we've also had people joining us from as far afield as Peru, Azerbaijan, Vietnam, Slovakia, Trinidad and Tobago, the Solomon Islands, just to name a few. But your participation has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. We've got another content-packed agenda tomorrow. with a second fantastic day and some more really great speakers and some very different speakers too. Please travel safely. I would normally say that, though I recognize for most of you, it's traveling from one part of your residence to another in this virtual environment that we live in, that we are living in. But please come back tomorrow. Join us at 9:25 UK time tomorrow morning. I'm really looking forward to it, and we're looking forward to seeing you again then. Thank you very much.